So here's what these flukes look like. You can definitely see how they are flat and leaf-shaped. Here a diagram on the fluke anatomy. You can see the oral sucker and the ventral sucker, and then here would be the intestine. And then they have testes and ovaries in the same animal. That means they're hermaphrodites. Over here, a Chinese liver fluke, that's Clunorchis sinensis. This one. You can also see ovaries and testes in the same animal. It's a light microscope picture. This thing is pretty large. Take a look here. This is 5 millimeters, so you can see this thing is pretty large. And then here, over here, the oral sucker. And, well, that's a fluke. Here's the life cycle of a lung fluke, in this case, Paragonymous species. They're fairly complex life cycles. In this case, we have 2 intermediate hosts, and then, of course, the definitive host. So let's start out here with number 1. There will be the adult living in a human lung. In this case, it's hermaphroditic, as you have seen. That adult fluke, therefore, releases a lot of eggs into the human lung. And these eggs, they would have to reach water after being excreted, a lot of times in fecal material. And so they reach a body of water. Then this merocidium develops, hatches from the eggs, and enters a snail. So you have to have this particular intermediate host. If you don't have these particular intermediate host in the life cycle of a worm, like this would be disrupted, and you would not find it. The snail is an intermediate host, and inside of the snail, this merocidium develops into radia, which then reproduce asexually. And these Carsaria, they leave the snail and enter the crayfish. That makes the crayfish a second intermediate host right here. So the crayfish is another intermediate host, and that would be the Cercaria state. And then metacercaria, they develop in the crayfish. These cercaria, they will insist to produce metacercaria, and then an infected crayfish may be eaten by a human, and then the metacercaria develop into the adult fluke, which then will produce lots and lots of eggs. Since it's a hermaphrodite, it's easy for them, and then we're just gonna go around in the life cycle. So in this case, we have 2 intermediate hosts, 1 definitive host. The definitive host is the human in this case, because this is where the adult fluke is. So where the adult fluke is and reproduces, that's the definitive host. The snail and the crayfish are considered intermediate hosts because they do not host the adult form of the fluke. Okay, Cestoda up next here. Those are tapeworms, and of course they're also flatworms, so they're in a group of the platyhelminths. The cestoda or tapeworms, they have a head that's called a scolex. That's a term that you need to know. Scolex is the head portion of the tapeworm that has the suckers for attachment to a surface, or typically inside of the intestine, they will attach to the intestinal walls. And then they absorb food through a cuticle, and then the body segments of a tapeworm, they're called proglottids right here. And the proglottids, they contain male and female reproductive organs. They're also hermaphroditic. That means they have ovaries and testes in each one of these segments, which ensures high reproductive success. Let's take a look at the general anatomy of a tapeworm. So here will be the scolex portion. That's the head part right here, and it has hooks right here, and then suckers. So that's the scolex. And then the parts, that will be the proglottids. You see these segments right here? These are the proglottids. And of course, you have a lot of them in such a tapeworm right here. This thing is long tape. And then in each one of these segments, in these proglottids, you have testes and ovaries to ensure very high reproductive success. For the tapeworms, humans can be either definitive hosts or intermediate hosts. Let's take a look first at humans as definitive hosts. In this case, the eggs from the proglottids are ingested, hatch into larvae, and then they will just drill themselves or attach themselves to the intestinal wall and then produce the adult form of the worm. A good example for this would be Tinea solium, the pork tapeworm. Now moving on to tapeworms where humans are intermediate hosts. In this case, the eggs are ingested and hatch in the intestine, but then the larva will migrate to the liver or lungs, develop into a cyst kind of form. And here we have an example, Echinococcus granulosus. So here's the life cycle of a tapeworm, the Echinococcus species. Starting up here with number 1, the adult tapeworm releases the eggs. Now humans are the intermediate host. We're playing intermediate host in this case. Now humans are listed here as a dead-end type of intermediate host, but here's another intermediate host version, that deer right here, and also ingest the eggs. In this case, the eggs will hatch, and then the larva will migrate to the liver or the lung, and then the larva will develop into this hydatid cyst. Right here, this would be the cyst version of it. And now here comes the definitive host ingesting those cysts. So the definitive host here would be this wolf or coyote, looks like a wolf. And now the definitive host, of course, then it's called definitive host because it will harbor the adult version of the worm. So here these cysts, they will develop into the adult tapeworm and then reproduce there and then release more eggs, which can be then will be ingested by an intermediate host, and we're going around. Next up, some roundworms. That's the group of the nematodes. They are cylindrical. They have a complete digestive system. They are dioecious. That means they're separate male and female animals. The males contain spicules, and they are free-living or parasitic. The eggs of the nematodes can be infective for humans. Here are 2 examples. Ascaris lumbricoides infects human intestines, and the Enterobius vermicularis, the pinworm, that's also fairly often seen in humans. The other 2 we don't really need. So just the Ascaris lumbricoides and the Enterobius vermicularis, the pinworm. So here would be Enterobius vermicularis, the pinworm. Over here you have an image of an adult pinworm. You can tell how the female is actually bigger than the male. They tend to sort of hug each other all the time to ensure reproductive success. With the female about a centimeter long, so 8 to 13 millimeters, and then the male smaller, just 2 to 5 millimeters. They live inside of the intestine, and the weird thing is about them is that at night they tend to migrate to the anus and just kind of take a look, apparently, and also deposit their eggs. So here, let me show you some disgusting pictures. So this is what these guys do. So at night, they migrate to the anal opening. Now you can see them over here. And so right here, and it starts itching. That's why kids or people that are infected with pinworms, they tend to itch their butt, and it's very itchy. They try to scratch it. And so here would be sort of this a continuous cycle of infection. So the eggs are being deposited at the anal opening right here, and it's people will scratch themselves because it's itchy, and then I guess, I don't know, I'm not sure how many people do that, but you get reinfected by eating ingesting these eggs, and then you just keep getting reinfected with this. And of course, then over here, the larvae, they will hatch in the small intestine, and then the adults, they will produce lots of eggs, and the females, of course, and then they will deposit them again around the perianal opening right here. Next up, some roundworms, nematodes, where the larvae are infected for humans. There's some examples here. Strongyloides, that one's not that important for you guys, but Nicator americanus, this one here you should know about. Those are hookworms that enter the skin and are carried to the intestines. In dogs, a lot of times, Dirofilaria immitis, the heartworm. This one is spread by mosquitoes, causes heartworm infection in dogs, typically. So here would be a heart that is full of heartworms right here. Next up are some pictures that I took myself in a farmer's market in Peru. And I found this really interesting with it because there was this guy, he had his booth right there on the farmer's market, and he had some pictures of kids. Take a look at this one here. This kid is itching his butt or scratching his butt, and so that would be a pinworm infection, pretty typical. And he had a nice specimen there in his bottles right there showing, and of course he was trying to sell his remedies, natural remedies to help with worm infections. But I just found it interesting. He was explaining how it all works, and it was really kind of cool watching him and listening to him, how he was explaining about worm infections, which definitely are a big problem, not in the United States, but other than that, worldwide, they are a big problem. And here, Phytosan was his remedy. Here you can see somebody's butt and a lot of worms that are coming out of there. So anyway, it was kind of interesting. Here was just more up close his samples that he had of the different types of worms that can affect humans. And then here was sort of stacked up a bunch of remedies that I was kind of intrigued with looking through that. Anyway, so back to our textbook. There you have a picture that is thought to have contributed to this rod of Asclepius, which is sort of the symbol for the medical profession. And it is very likely that it came from this rod that was used to spool out or pull out a worm that somebody was infected with. So it's this is a parasitic guinea worm, and it's being pulled out by rolling it around this rod, and it does resemble this rod of Asclepius here as the logo or symbol for the medical profession. Lastly, we're going to finish up here with arthropods as vectors. Arthropods, arthro means joint, or in this case, joint-footed animals. So arthropods are joint-footed animals with segmented bodies. They have hard exoskeletons, so external skeletons, and then jointed legs. Vectors, so when arthropods become vectors, that means the arthropod will carry a pathogenic microorganism and then transmit it. So there are some classes of arthropods that are known to transmit disease, so as vectors. If they have 8 legs, we call them arachnids. Then there are some crustaceans. They have 4 antennae. And then the insects, they have 6 legs, but all of them have segmented bodies. And here are some arthropods as vectors. The mosquito is, of course, it will suck blood, and it can transmit via its saliva. It can transmit pathogens. It's a fairly frequent kind of vector. Then over here is a tick. This one, you can tell it has 8 legs. Also can transmit disease, of course. And here would be sort of a few samples here of arthropod vectors. There will be a louse right here, a flea, another deer fly, and then here the kissing bug. That one we had last week on our pathogen group. That was the trypanosomiasis that's transmitted through the kissing bug. And final here, our last, showing how arthropods can serve as vectors. And there could be mechanical transmission, meaning that let's say a fly carries some pathogens on its feet and it's landing on you and transmitting the pathogen. Biological transmission would mean that the pathogen first multiplies in the vector, and then let's say the mosquito is sucking blood and it's also putting the pathogen into your bloodstream, into your body. And a definitive host means that the microbe's sexual reproduction takes place in the vector itself.